Okay, well, I'm sure there'll be some more people joining us. In fact, people are still coming in. But if I just get started, as you can probably see on your screens, my name is Chris Cowton. I'm Associate Director at the Institute of Business Ethics. I'd like to welcome you all today to today's webinar, particularly anyone who's new to the IBE, and this is the first time you join one of our events. Our role is to champion the highest standards of ethical behaviour in business, and we do that through lots of ways: research, thought leadership, training, advisory work with companies and other organizations, but we also convene networks and events. Today it's one of our events. So this is one of our free webinars, which we run on a regular basis. Today's topic, as you probably know, having registered, is embedding human rights in decision-making and the supply chain. And I'm delighted that we've got two very knowledgeable speakers with us today. We have Dr. Dorothée Baumann-Pauly, Director of the Geneva Center for Business and Human Rights, and we have Aaron Campbell, who's an experienced corporate lawyer. So those are our two experts today. We also want to hear from you. Our session today will be interactive, and there'll be plenty of time to answer your questions. So please type your questions in the Q&A box as we go along. You may post those anonymously if you wish, but it's nice to have your name if you're happy to put your name, have your name showing there. You can also comment or vote on other questions by using the thumbs up button. And also I'd like to thank you at this stage, in case I forget, anyone who sent in a question before the webinar began, when you registered, thank you for doing so. I was just remarking to our speakers, I think we have more questions of a higher quality than almost any other webinar I've chaired. So congratulate yourselves already if you submitted a question. We hope you don't have any technical problems. If you do have any technical problems, then please use the chat function. So it's chat function for technical problems, which Katie or Alex will help you with. It's Q&A for asking questions of our speakers. So if you could just get your input into the right box, that'd be very, very helpful. The webinar is being recorded, and we will be making it available on demand through our website. So one of the great things is this is not only hopefully a good event, but it becomes a resource that we share with the wider world and has very much an afterlife as well. We will be tweeting through the event using the tag at IBEUK. That's just IBEUK, no hyphens or anything like that in there. So if you want to join in with that, that'd be great. But without further ado, let me introduce our first speaker, who is Dr. Dorothée Baumann-Pauly. So, Doro, you're kicking us off today. Could you just tell us something about your background and what brought you to examining business and human rights, and what it is you actually do on a daily basis, please?
All right. Thank you, Chris. Thanks for having me. Thanks for putting together this event. I look forward to the conversation with you and with Aaron. So how did I get to business and human rights? I have a PhD in economics from the University of Zurich. And I started this PhD because during my studies in political science, I realized more and more that it's not the states that are making all the rules in a globalized economy, but often it's private actors, such as companies, that are actually have more resources, more leverage, and also greater interests in designing and enforcing rules that are de facto binding for workers, for example. And that observation through reading the news and traveling, inspired me to start a PhD on what was at the time called corporate social responsibility. It was the label at the time used to capture this new so-called political role of multinational corporations. And I developed a concept of corporate social responsibility that's actually called political CSR. It's a concept that has become quite much discussed in academia, but it's unheard of in practice. I know that because throughout my PhD, I've actually worked in practice as well. I've had a hybrid career. One foot in academia all the time, but most of the time the other foot was outside of academia, working for so-called multi-stakeholder initiatives. These are initiatives that bridge between the private sector and civil society, and I often had this role as a mediator, for example, with the Fair Labor Association. And through this activity, I really got to see different sides of that discourse that is now termed business and human rights. I think what I've been doing has has always been business and human rights, because I'd like to know how private actors can support the implementation of human rights through their core business practices. So not as a side note or something they do when money is left over, but through the way how they organize their business, through their core business practices. And this is also what I do today. I'm, as you said, Chris, directing the Geneva Center for Business Human Rights, but 10 years ago, I joined the NYU Stern Center for Business Human Rights as the research director. At the time, this was the very first human rights center at a business school in the world, I believe. So it's very new to discuss human rights in a business school context and in business school education. But we strongly believe that future managers need to know how to manage human rights challenges. These challenges are complex and difficult, and I think many underestimate how difficult they are. So I think it's just fair to say that we need to train future managers and give them some safety to discuss these issues in a classroom prior to throwing them out in the world. And then they have to deal with things that I know today keep managers up at night, because human lives are at stake. I've just returned from the Congo, where I looked into human rights issues in cobalt mining, and I visited artisanal cobalt mines, and during my time there, people died on that site. So it's, when I say lives are at stake, that's not an exaggeration. So, and this idea of NYU Stern's approach to human rights and business school education, I've now taken to Geneva, where I launched the center in 2019. And I'm very happy that it's not just those two centers in the world that are now looking into how can human rights be integrated into business school education, but we now work through a network of business schools that comprise almost 100 schools from around the world today. Lots of individuals believe that indeed human rights should become a core subject as we prepare future managers. So that's what I do right now, and it also includes research, teaching, and advocacy, and hopefully the institutionalization of human rights in business school education.
That's great. Thank you for that introduction. I mean, it's interesting that you did work in New York, because, of course, starting in CSR, I mean, CSR for many American scholars as well as practitioners is corporate philanthropy. Yeah. It's not how you do your business, it's what you do on the side of your business. Mm-hmm. And I guess it's also interesting that you're talking about human rights keeping managers up at, awake at night worrying about it. So it's not necessarily about just shouting at them to take human rights into account, but they are being affected by human rights. So when it comes down to it, what do you mean by embedding human rights? I think that's the verb we've used, isn't it, in the supply chain? And what are the key ways of doing that? I mean, obviously we'll explore these through the Q&A, but just some brief thoughts about key ways of embedding.
Mm-hmm. So I've actually used this term embedding as well in my publications, but I'm not a native speaker yet. I do believe this term best describes what I mean by, it's a topic that seeps through the fabric of an organization until it truly becomes its DNA. And, leading managers would say, this is how we do business. This is what I mean by embedding. It's becoming the way how a business operates. And how do we get there? I think it's critical for business leaders to reflect on the business models that so often drive human rights issues into the supply chain. I do believe there's a trickle down effect from how do we demand things to be produced. If you think of manufacturing, for example, in long supply chains, if buyers or brands, for example, in the context of the apparel industry, demand clothes to be produced ever cheaper, ever faster, there are incentives from the top that translate down to the suppliers into direct human rights risks for workers, because they're under tremendous production pressures. And that's why I believe it's those business models that we need to critically reflect on, because it's those business models at the top of the chain that often drive human rights risks through the entire chain to the weakest link. And often the weakest links are workers.
Yeah, I mean, without putting them under pressure, I think, that idea of the business models and how decisions are made will link very closely to what Aaron's going to tell us in a minute as well. But before we get to Aaron, and we know challenges and we know difficulties and constraints that we're all under in business. It can be difficult when your competitors act in one way or you're short of resources or whatever. But can you give us some examples where embedding human rights has been done really well, perhaps in challenging circumstances?
Yeah, I really like that you're asking about the good examples, because we have a tendency in the business human rights field to look at things that don't go so well and violations. But I'm actually looking for the good business practices, because I think they can inspire, and we should learn from them and see how we can mainstream them throughout industries. And in this context, I've worked for a long time on the garment supply chain, so I want to stick to that industry for a moment. I've looked into the purchasing practices of fashion brands and how they place orders from brand to suppliers. And for a long time after Rana Plaza, I looked into Bangladesh, but then in the context of fashion brands' interest to distribute risks more, they've started exploring Ethiopia and as sort of the new frontier of the fashion industry. And I wanted to see how the fashion industry operates in this entirely new context for the industry. And I come across one brand that in terms of their purchasing practices, I thought was very innovative, particularly in this very new context where workers had never even worked in an industrial setting before. These workers were farmers prior to coming to an entirely newly built factory, which caused all kinds of problems for most brands. But this one brand that I investigated in this context was Decathlon. It's a French sportswear retailer, had from the outset said, we can only make it work in Ethiopia if we commit to this sourcing destination long term. So versus getting in because there's currently no legal minimum wage, and it looked at a glance very cheap to produce there. They said, well, hang on, if we do Ethiopia, we should set up operations so that we can be there for the next 10 to 20 years. And this is a time horizon which is unheard of in the industry, where often orders are placed for a few months and then the brand ends the business relationship with the supplier again. And the fact that Decathlon had this long-term vision through so-called strategic partnerships in this new sourcing destination made a huge difference for how they operate there. They invested heavily in training this very inexperienced workforce, which was key to improving productivity in their factories. And with productivity gains, they could also pay additional bonuses to a salary that was too low to live on. So thanks to those bonus payments, like loyalty bonus payments, extra productivity bonus payments, they could bring up an industry wage that was way too low for workers to survive on. It's a particularly challenging context also because in the past years, there was a civil war in Ethiopia. And to me, this was a litmus test for Decathlon's commitment to this country. And as far as I know, of course, they had to close the production sites in Mekelle in the north, which is in the Tigray region, but they still have production in other parts of the country. So they're hoping to stick this out, and the business practices to bring the skills of the workforce up, they continue. And the fact that they make a business plan jointly with the supplier that lasts initially 5, but ideally 10 years, this is very unusual in this industry. And it at least gives the implementation of a code of conduct, which all fashion brands put on the wall in the factories. It gives this implementation of the code of conduct a real chance. If you're only in a factory for 3 months, it's almost cynical to put up a code of conduct on the wall because you just won't have the time. You won't stick around long enough to implement that. So that's one example where I felt those purchasing practices of Decathlon. I described them in great detail in a case study, which I'm happy to share with you. The case studies are available for free on our website, is something that other fashion brands could learn from and understand how to also bring down turnover rates, because that's a big concern in the fashion industry, that you train workers and then they leave again because they're for some reason unhappy in their jobs. And the fact that Decathlon had brought down a turnover rate of that was in some factories 100%. So within a year, the entire workforce had to be switched out. That is a good indication for me that those workers also felt happier and more content with their jobs at these factories. So it's an indication, if workers stay, that they're happier with their jobs compared to other factories where they just spent a few months and then left again. I have many other examples. Chris, you tell me how much time I have.
Well, I should probably let's weave some examples into the replies to the questions as well. But thank you for that one. Really excellent. One of our colleagues, who's very much a founding father of business ethics in the UK, Simon Webley, always used to talk about staff turnover being such a critical indicator of the culture of an organization. So I thought that was very good, very interesting. And I think time horizon on decisions is massively important, as we know in many areas of business ethics. But that was great. And I think, was that the link you put in the chat? Was that to the case study? But we will, for those that are watching,
all our case studies, yes.
Yeah, we will. We'll send those links around afterwards as well in the follow-up to the webinar. So thank you for that, Doro. Look forward to hearing more of your insights and wisdom. Now move on to Aaron. Now I billed you as an experienced corporate lawyer, Aaron. The subtext is you're not a human rights lawyer, are you? So can you tell us something about your background and what brought you to human rights, and also, what you currently do?
Oh, absolutely. So thank you, Chris, for putting this event together. So my background, as you say, is I'm a corporate finance lawyer and a capital markets lawyer by training and background. So I studied law as part of studying law at university at undergraduate level. I did study human rights, but clearly my focus when I qualified was I worked at Herbert Smith as a corporate finance lawyer. I then moved in-house to work in investment banking, where I worked on EMEA transactions, corporate finance, international capital markets, private equity transactions, where major corporations that we were advising were looking at growing their international footprint. So they were moving predominantly into international markets. So a lot of the advisory work that I was doing was looking at sort of international compliance standards, transparency in investments, transactions across different countries in EMEA. I was a member of the investment committee teams. I was also part of the new business committee. So I was seeing firsthand how C-suite executives and senior executives in financial services were approaching their decision making. I subsequently moved in-house and have worked as a general counsel. I'm currently working as general counsel in a energy business and waste and recycling business. So sustainability is obviously a key issue there. And I've also worked in an international transport business. So that, however, was combined with, outside of my corporate practice, I was doing voluntary work with a number of NGOs and charities, predominantly operating in East Africa. So in 2012, again in 2018, again in 2019, I did placements out in Rwanda, Burundi, Kenya, and Uganda, where I was working with NGOs who were looking at doing capacity building for communities that were impacted by business decisions, and where those individuals were looking at whether it was their land had been deprived from them, whether it was the labour standards that they had when they were working in tea and cotton fields, or whether it was simply that they were the victims of local decision making by political elites who were working alongside corporations in terms of deciding how they would allow investment permits to be given for those international corporations to be allowed to carry out their investment and business growth. So I think it's the combination of those two, the corporate work on the one hand and the voluntary NGO work and the placements I did on the ground, which allowed my corporate interest and my human rights observations on the ground to start to merge. And that led me to start asking some questions, because I could see there was a clear disconnect. On the one hand, I was working with C-suite executives, chief executive officers, chief investment officers, chief commercial officers, C-suite executive teams who were making decisions that impacted local communities abroad, but who weren't necessarily involved directly in consultation with those impacted communities. And on the other hand, communities who were the recipients of those decisions, but who had no idea who was making those decisions and whether or not their interests were being taken into account. And so it's the intersection between corporate investment decision making and human rights, which became my primary interest.
Okay, I think you then followed up, thank you for that, followed up with some research. You put your academic hat back on, at least on a part-time basis, or, you know, and investigated that. And of course, you had some unique resources and access to do that. So do you want to tell us a little bit about your research and then kind of where your thinking's got to on where you might go with this?
Yeah, no, absolutely. So on the back of that observation that I had both as a corporate lawyer and as a volunteer on the ground in those countries, I decided I wanted to put a firmer academic foundation behind my interest in this area. So I undertook a master's at London School of Economics in Human Rights and International Law, with a particular focus on this issue of the intersection between business activity and human rights. And what I noticed when I started that research is that there seemed to be, I mean, Dorothy mentioned earlier, and we tend to have a focus to look at the negative cases rather than the positive. And when I looked at the literature and when I spoke to stakeholders in the human rights industry, I think there were basically 4 critiques which were made around the ways in which corporations and business were approaching this whole area. There was the critique from NGOs and charities, which was that they felt there was a lack of legal obligation and a lack of accountability on corporations, and in particular on directors, for the decisions that they made. But they felt that that was backed up by organizations having an inadequate business ethics framework and a refusal and reluctance to engage and consult. So a lot of NGOs said to me that they had tried to get an audience with chief executives, chief commercial officers, chief financial officers of major transnational corporations, and had simply failed to be able to get that. They were not willing to do so. At most, they were directed to corporations' compliance teams or to their legal teams, but none of the CEOs or CFOs or CIOs were willing to sit down and discuss directly with those NGOs, and that was a cause of frustration. The second critique I saw through the literature was human rights lawyers and law firms who felt that corporations were hiding behind complex group structures. And there was this myth of the local subsidiary decision-making as they saw it, when in fact, the parent company very often had a degree of control, which meant they should be accountable for the end impact that resulted from the investment. And then the third critique was the academic critique. And I think Dorothy started to touch on this, in that I think a lot of academics feel that terminology has started to become a little bit confused. So some people will talk about ESG, some people still talk about CSR, some people have started to talk about business human rights or business in human rights. And I think through that, terminology has become to be very important, because some corporations, I think, sometimes have confused the differences between those three or can't adequately distinguish which they are. And very often it's led to a very narrow perception of stakeholders whose interest companies believe that they should be protecting. And then the final critique was the community critique. And this was where local communities were saying that it almost appeared to them that there was a corporate complicity, a triumvirate of corporate investors on the one hand, local state actors who were approving the investment on the ground, and local elites. And that was leading to misplaced consultation, leading to misplaced solutions. So very often corporations would come to a local community, for example, in East Africa, would offer a solution of, we will build a school or we will build this facility, but without adequately consulting with the local community as to whether or not that met their local needs. So when I looked at those 4 critiques, it seemed to me, as someone who had worked in corporations and who had been around the investment committee table, who had been around the C-suite table, there was the missing voice. Because to me, the thing that was screaming out was, but where's the perspective of the chief executives, the chief financial officers, the chief commercial officers? What's their view on decision making in this space? What's their view on human rights and their responsibilities in this area? And so that led me, therefore, to do a research project, which was called How Are Investment Decisions Made, where my objective was to speak directly to the C-suite, to C-suite executives. So I didn't want to speak to any in-house lawyers. I didn't want to speak to the compliance officers. Very often I was pushed in that direction. But I wanted to speak directly to C-suite executives who were the decision makers, to ask them to talk me through, from their perspective, the norms, the processes, the frameworks through which their actual decisions were made, over and above what the actual written policies and documents of the organisation said. And that proved to be a challenge to get those conversations. For 2 reasons. One, because, as you can imagine, most organisations wanted me to speak to their legal teams first, and the legal teams wanted to know, why do you want to speak to our executives? What do you want to ask them? Why don't you just speak to us? We can give you the policies for our organisation. We can tell you what our policies say. So, and the second reason was, I think that there was a nervousness on the part of some organisations that this could potentially be a little bit of a hatchet job, and that there could be leaks into the media that perhaps would be detrimental to the reputation of those companies. So the key for me, and the reason why I think I was able to complete this research, is the fact that I had worked in financial services and worked in corporations. So I was able to directly approach C-suite executives that I knew and to persuade them to take part based on their prior relationship with me, of having worked with me and therefore trusting me. And then there was the snowball effect of recruiting additional chief executives, chief financial officers, chief commercial officers, who they would then turn and say, we've done the interview, we've done the research study with Aaron, you can trust him, therefore you should take part. And through that snowball effect, I managed to pull together a good body of individuals who are willing to take part.
Okay, and what were your key findings, just briefly, Aaron? Then we'll explore them a bit more in the Q&A as well. But yeah, a couple of headlines that you like.
So I would say I would pull out 3 quick headlines. I would say, first of all, understanding value is a key issue for the C-suite. What they're struggling with in a context where strategic financial value and financial value is central to how they are assessed internally and to whether or not they're deemed to have done a good job, is how does value get defined and determined in terms of human rights? That's one of the key challenges I think we need to answer if we're going to ask C-suite executives to engage with human rights in a way that allows it to be embedded into their organizational culture. I think the second issue is there was a real sense, a consistent response that new law and regulation will not shift the dial. You know, terms like it's a cottage industry, this is a cottage industry for compliance officers and for lawyers, and this is not driving value, and this is not our responsibility, came up again and again. And I think the third area that really needs consideration was the lack of evaluation. So a lot of the C-suite said that actually the issue is not law versus regulation or binding law versus soft law. The real issue is 2 areas of evaluation: the paucity of evaluation of the actual decision-making process itself within those organizations, i.e. what information is given to the decision makers, which information is filtered out, which information is deemed to be of value, which information is simply deemed to be a risk that can be priced. And then the second issue of evaluation is actually the qualification and expertise of the decision makers and C-suite members themselves, and how we can improve that such that human rights and environmental issues are issues in which they feel equipped to make decisions, and not something that they immediately feel they need to outsource to their compliance and legal team. So I'll say those are probably 3 key findings.
Yeah, okay, thanks so much for that, Aaron. I think, Dora's probably sees some resonances with what she's found in her perspective. Putting words into your mouth there, Dora. You can come back at me on that. But I think that idea of kind of will presumably someone's just checking we're not doing anything bad is probably where an awful lot of firms are, and maybe where Decathlon was rather different. But also that idea of equipping, people have a great deal of expertise. These are not idiots in the C-suite. They're experts, and they're not necessarily evil people either. They're not wanting to harm the world necessarily, but just what's getting to them, how's it being framed, do they have the information, and also do they have sufficient expertise or tools, which Dora was talking about earlier about training people. They're not equipped necessarily, which is not to excuse or anything like that. It's just it's clearly a barrier to doing more. Now, Dora, briefly, is there anything you'd wanted to come back before we get to the Q&A, just in response to...
I really enjoyed Aaron's observations, because indeed they correspond with mine. And I think if you look at corporate scandals or crises that happened in the past, you can often trace back this communication breakdown somewhere in the organizational hierarchy. Sometimes I was a very engaged, business human rights team that kept flagging something might be off here, but it never reached the top level. So there was a disconnect between top and bottom. I've also lately spoken to a number of very, very inspiring CEOs that make huge commitments and are really committed to human rights. But then I hear from people in the organization that they're overwhelmed with the commitments on the top because they don't have enough staff at the bottom to actually then implement the many initiatives that this organization had signed up for example. So matching capacities, or matching ambition with capacities is another important thing, where within organizations, we need to have a careful look if they're truly prepared. Last word, in my context on business human rights, there's now mandatory human rights due diligence legislation coming up, and I see a great tendency that this well-intentioned regulation has the unfortunate effect that in many organizations, this topic is relegated to legal teams, because then with this mandatory human rights due diligence requirement, it is unfortunately turned into a very narrow compliance issue. And it's legal teams that sort of fend off risks. It's a pure risk perspective. And unfortunately, that kills the idea that engaging in business human rights brings lots of opportunities for corporations as well. So that is unfortunate. It's often the senior executives that are not well trained on human rights that then rely on their legal teams to just safeguard them. And this often means moving out of very complex, difficult contexts versus remedying those issues. It often means, taking fewer risks at the expense of actually implementing human rights in their spirit.
Yes, and I think certainly at the Institute of Business Ethics, we are the Institute of Business Ethics, not the Institute of Business Compliance, and the importance of values being worked through, whatever those values are in the context of the business. Yes, compliance is there as a tool, as to sort of set the minimum, but it needs to be more than just compliance if your values are going to live, I guess. Now, I've had a couple of questions in the Q&A box already. That's great, and I will be looking at those. But we also had the questions that came in first when people registered. I'm just sort of trying to work a way through in what might almost be a logical order. There'll be limited logic to it. But I suppose one of the things is, it's interesting what you said there about ambitions. Are there any ambitions? And if there are ambitions, are they too great? So if we're in a business and we're kind of wanting to get started, is it evolution or revolution, or how do you get started on thinking about business and human rights? Maybe you've got something in place. For example, I think a lot of people you talked about human rights just think modern slavery, which of course we do have legislation on now, but it's more than that, isn't it? So do you build on that, or do you build on something else, or how can you get started? It's an organization, and is it a revolution? Is it kind of a big bang, or is it something you can evolve from what you've got already? Any insights into that?
Yeah, I would be interested in giving you the answer, Chris, that the C-suite executives answered when I asked them a very similar question in terms of where they would start if they were being asked to design. And what they all said to me is that effectively there's a place they look to when they are making their investment decisions. There's a place they look to in terms of what sets the framework and the constraints for their decision, and that starts with the corporate purpose for them. So very much for them, it's a case of, is there an overarching corporate purpose which reflects human rights considerations and all of the other business ethics considerations alongside all of the financial objectives? And the reason why that's so important is because the corporate purpose for them then drives the strategic investment plan. And that strategic investment plan, which very often can be a 3-year business plan, a 5-year business plan, really sets the agenda for the next sort of, the next year, the next 2 years, the next 3 years of their decision making. But more importantly, most of the C-suite felt that once that was set and approved, it was very difficult for them to make any strategic decisions which deviated from that plan. So that's where they look to when they're thinking around, okay, what is this organization about? What's it for? What's its values? What's it trying to achieve in terms of its social impact? They looked much more, they said, to the corporate purpose and the strategic plan rather than to the policies, which very often sit with the legal and compliance team. And so I think it's around early intervention and early engagement in influencing that corporate plan, corporate purpose, and then that strategic plan. And then, of course, it's around, as Dorothée said, it's around feeding down, cascading down into the organization, how those values then shape an organizational culture through the processes and the norms which take hold in the decision making. And that then needs to feed down to having adequate resources to implement that on a day-to-day project level. So it almost becomes corporate purpose, strategic plan, organizational culture, resources on the ground to implement the projects. And over time, you will hopefully start to build in much the way that climate change has started to become more of a market expectation and a business norm. Not saying that's been done perfectly, but it's much more of a norm than human rights are. I think you will start to build an organizational culture and an embedding of human rights principles, which has perhaps got more traction than we currently see.
Yeah, I think it's interesting, this idea about the strategic investment plan once set, because that's the deal the C-suite has with the board, isn't it? That's where they're and probably talk to the market about it as well. That's so unless purpose and values get into that, that's it's not going to happen. But if they do get in a meaningful way, that sort of sets, at least gives a chance, doesn't it? During the ensuing period. Dora, did you want to make a comment on that? I think you came off mute, did you?
Yeah, I'd love to back up Aaron's statements again, in that in one of these conversations with, what I consider an inspiring CEO most recently, he told me, when I decide over where to produce our goods, I always ask myself the following question: would I take my children there? So this overall purpose of is this a place where I would be comfortable to take my children to, in all these conditions that I would be happy to explain to my children as sort of a, to explain to me how purpose drives this strategic plan that Aaron just described. I thought that was interesting in a, just in the form of a very simple question. When I talk to other corporate representatives, they often tell me that their path towards business and human rights is a journey. And clearly that indicates that they are more on this evolutionary approach, not the revolution, but an evolution. It's a journey. And I must say, I always challenge them on this sort of metaphor, because no company would be on a journey towards making profit. I think that wouldn't be acceptable. So can we be on a journey towards respecting human rights? I don't think that's acceptable either. So in terms of, evolution or revolution, I understand that the implementation of a strategic plan takes time, particularly if the organization is large, to build those capacities, etc. So I acknowledge that it takes time, and that might be an evolution. However, I think we won't succeed unless we accept that we need a revolution of some sort, because unless we understand how business models drive human rights into global supply chains, we will only scratch on the surface. And I want to give you one example of that. For many years, the garment industry and fashion brands have tried to fix labor rights issues in global supply chains through social auditing. So they didn't change their business model or their business practices or their purchasing practices, but they just added inspections at the factories to record all violations of their code. That, however, didn't change anything. They returned with a list of things that went wrong, but they didn't know why these things went wrong and what were the drivers for the things that went wrong. And often those drivers were sitting at the top of the supply chain in the way how the brand placed orders and organized purchasing practices. So that's why I think this polishing approach in form of like we continue doing business as usual and we make tiny tweaks or additions here or there might not lead to success in terms of establishing truly responsible supply chains. We need some form of revolution where someone is courageous enough to say, let's critically reflect on how our own business models affect human rights throughout the entire chain, and how can we align our strategic plan accordingly to fix root causes rather than just treating symptoms.
Okay, thank you. Now, the C-suite operates in a context, doesn't it? So there's the board but also there's investors. So a couple of questions came in on around that sort of area. So one was really asking, do CEOs and boards of large corporates express the need for help making the case for integrating human rights into their strategic plans with investors? So how does that conversation go, or how can it go between a business and investors? And another one is kind of connected to that, which is, well, what do we know about how the market reacts to companies that take a human rights approach or have a bad reputation for human rights? So what's it looking like from the investor side? Are they okay with a business going out and really respecting strongly human rights, or would they say no, or whatever? Talk me through that one a little bit. What's your take on that then, Doro? Is that something you've looked at in your work, that the investor market relationship?
I did, but I think Aaron is ready to respond.
Okay,
for me, clearly ESG, environmental, social governance data is increasingly in demand, and it's a big driver for corporations to look into environmental, social, and governance aspects of their operations. And yet, I must say, from a human rights perspective, we need to improve the S in ESG to actually deliver on the substance of the S, because right now the S is mostly ill-defined and narrow, and not capturing the full spectrum of human rights. Possibly only, diversity and inclusion, or health and safety aspects, and maybe modern slavery, but not the full spectrum of potential human rights challenges that could affect the success of a company. So we, and I also mean academia in this sense, could help to substantiate the S for companies that operate in very different industry aspects. But I do believe investors, if they would have better S data, could be very powerful drivers for corporate decision making.
Yes, I'm sure that would also then, depending on how that S is defined with regard to human rights, obviously give some tools or some focus for C-suites to think about these things. Yeah. Aaron, did you have some thoughts on this?
Yeah, I was going to say it's become quite a standard part of my role as general counsel now to get requests from investors, shareholders who need information from the company and from the C-suite for the purposes of their own fund reporting. So if it's an investment fund or a private equity fund, very often they will have their own reporting obligations as a fund that they would then require their portfolio companies to provide information to them on. However, my experience has been reflects very much what Dorothée just said. most of the requests I would receive tend to be related to the E of ESG.
Right.
It's nearly always, the measures are nearly always environmental, climate change, net zero. I've never ever had a request for someone to turn and say to me, well, what impact would it have, this investment have on Indigenous people's right to their land? What impact does it have on displacement of people from business decisions? That isn't there. And I think that's just symptomatic of the fact that ESG has come to dominate this space. But the E's come to dominate. And I think the whole question of, so I think corporations and C-suites would ask for help, but I think they're probably more responding to the requests they receive from their investors and shareholders, which much more tends to be on the E. So therefore, naturally, that's where you put your focus when you're looking at your strategic plan or responding to your shareholders or reporting to the board. The S is the piece of work that needs to be done, the social value piece, attributing a metric of value to that, and there being pressure to say that actually the human rights implications of these decisions has value, and it has a value beyond the compliance and risk mitigation value. That the maintenance and promotion of social value should be at the very centre of what a strategic investment plan should have for a corporation. And I just don't think we're at that place at the moment.
Yeah, I think the S is certainly being debated more in ESG, isn't it? But the whole thing is just sort of kind of blown up. It's a mess. It's chaotic. But at least there's some data out there, more data than there used to be. I think it's also interesting to think about the way in which discussion of sustainability post the Brundtland report many years ago because at one time it was, all this has got a prehistory. When I first got into these areas, it was all about pollution. That's how you talked about the environmental impact of things. And of course, sustainability itself realized, and people think on that it's actually connected to people anyway. So I think as well as improving the S, I think it'd be very interesting to see how one might build the S to some extent on the back of the E. That's quite an abstract argument, I admit, so I will move swiftly on to something more practical. But I do think seeing those connections, since the E attention is there already, and how that can affect the S and picking up the right kind of data. But someone made a point in a question here, that some CAOs probably just don't care about human rights. So some, I don't know what it would be. I mean, at some personal level, they will be. I'm sure they're perfectly decent people, if you meet them outside work. But they've got a lot on their agenda. I'm not looking for sympathy here, but just practically, they've got so much stuff to cope with. So I think partly it is about giving them, helping them to see human rights as being relevant, and then giving them ways of thinking about it and doing something about it. But the interesting point here that was put in by Jim Bignall, if I give you a name, Jim, was not just investors maybe being a source of pressure, but maybe employees too.
Yeah.
You want to say something after yes there?
So I've never studied, the motivations of senior executives, because to me, they're not so important. I wanted to see what do they actually do, because I don't think you can single out one type of motivation only. It's typically a mix, They want to do the right thing, maybe some, others feel the pressure of ESG and investors. Others know it's, legally required certain things in certain jurisdictions. So the, we have a new German supply chain law, and even companies that are not, in Germany might consider this as the new sort of yardstick for operating. So there are now legal requirements, investor requirements, also clearly public expectations, and with the world increasingly being interconnected and every worker has a cell phone and can probably spiral a complaint into an international online campaign within a day or so with the help of internationally connected NGOs. So there are reputational risks, there are operational risks as well. I mean, I've known from mining companies that unless you manage community conflict well, your exploration is on standstill for months at a time, and that's very costly. So you want to actually figure out how to do this well upfront. It's just better business. It's just good business sometimes to get this right from the start. And I gave this example of Decathlon earlier in Ethiopia, where they tracked carefully the turnover rates. It's just better business if you don't have such high turnover rates. So even if you don't care about human rights, I think there are other business reasons, that could make you look into human rights aspects, because it's just better business. So.
Yes, I think we don't want to get into sort of like just do it because it's good business, but also, sometimes being ethical isn't good business. If one's honest, it will cost you. But on the other hand, to show people practical examples of how doing the right thing has actually led to good business outcomes, I think it is really good and practical and helpful. So with that in mind, thinking about sort of practicalities and maybe some nuances, I want to pick up some of the questions that may be getting in some of those details. So I think an interesting question Simon Ross has posed. It was in the context of modern slavery, but if I may, I'll broaden it out to the full human rights piece. SMEs, we're thinking about, Aaron, you were looking at C-suites. That's where, a lot of the time we're thinking about big corporations, but where do SMEs, perhaps UK-based SMEs or based in whichever country our participants are from? Thoughts on SMEs? Can they do, what can they do in this space when it comes to human rights?
Yeah, I think the challenge for SMEs is clearly a resourcing challenge, because some SMEs will have if we accept the premise that a lot of management teams are not yet up the learning curve to deal with all of these issues and the full range of human rights, that would naturally explain why they would look to their legal and compliance teams to help them with addressing those issues. But in some SMEs, they may not even have a substantial legal and compliance function. So therefore, they are by definition more dependent, if they're going to address this, they're on external assistance in terms of audits of their supply chains, in terms of being upskilled, in terms of changes in the law, in terms of actually being able to go out and do audits of their workers' conditions. And that clearly has a cost implication for an SME to be able to then engage with those external providers. So I think it is a challenge for SMEs. And should we have the same expectations on SMEs? I think instinctively our answer is well yes, because human rights is important for all individuals. But I just think there's a realism there that I think that at the stage we're at, I'm not sure we are going to see SMEs able to create the same kind of audit trails and audit quality as we expect from other organisations. I'm not sure that's realistic, although clearly, being a smaller organisation, they have smaller number of employees and therefore can probably more easily monitor the due diligence when they take on their employees. So I think I think that's quite a difficult question, actually, from a human rights point of view for SMEs.
I suppose, as often happens with SMEs, you say it's a resource issue. So much of what they do isn't done in the same formal way that you've got the expertise and the resource to do in a large company. So sometimes it's a question of getting yourself into networks or partnerships or relationships, which you just generally feel more comfortable with. That these are people on the same page as you are. That's a sort of a general way of putting it, because that's how you often do business as an SME anyway. There are people you find you can do business with, and others where it's just a pain. So it's trying to find organizations that seem to have a consistency with your own values. Also, of course, we're talking usually in a global context here. So I was wondering, and this is very much on the agenda, I suppose, post the Russian invasion of Ukraine. People are thinking much more carefully, I think, about which countries they do business in, possibly because of future political risk. But I was wondering, are there, forgetting political risk at the moment, but just implementing these, are there some parts of the world where it's relatively easy or possible to say, if we do business in here, we have suppliers in here, we will be able to set out certain policies consistent with our values, and we'll be able to deliver on those? Or are there certain countries where you just can't get the information, or there's not the infrastructure in place? So, I mean, going into Ethiopia, I guess there weren't so many international suppliers from Ethiopia accepting basic commodities? I mean, would Decathlon have to put things in place for that? Whereas some countries you go into and there's already an infrastructure that can help satisfy you that your policies are likely to be implemented. So different countries or parts of the world, or the kind of issues that you have to face in going into a country.
Let me react to that question. That is a truly difficult one, I must say, Chris, because I think if we look at the world today, we have more countries where governments are unable and unwilling to protect basic human rights than countries where governments deliver on human rights. So that is the world we live in, and we have to accept it as it is. As a corporation that is outsourcing production, you need to be carefully aware of, I think, these geopolitical risks that may affect your business. I think companies that had major investments in Russia learned that the hard way not too long ago, where there's clearly a public expectation to suspend business operations. Generally, I wouldn't be certain anywhere. I've seen sweatshop factories in Italy producing garments for the sake of putting the label "Made in Italy" into luxury garments, yet the workers were shipped in from China and lived under pretty horrendous conditions in Italy. But generally, of course, in the European Union, we have, I think, stronger labor rights protection and inspections than, let's say, in the global South, where I've just come back from the Democratic Republic of the Congo, as I mentioned earlier, and I learned that in the entire country, there are 200 labor inspectors. So it's a clearly inadequate labor inspectorate for a country of over 90 million people. So I think the infrastructure is better in some places than in others, but I wouldn't trust any context. I would double check. And the earlier discussion on sort of what can SMEs do, what we've seen in a study is that smaller companies are often founded on very strong values. And so their purpose statement is there from the start. They have also very close business ties to their suppliers that they build sometimes over generations, which can help the fact that you want to know quite a lot about everyone you work with, no matter where it is. And that is arguably much harder for larger corporations with thousands of suppliers and very complex supply chains. So geopolitics alone, I think, is not the only risk, but the fact that with a large organization, you don't have the same close business ties and the closeness of understandings of what your business partners are doing. So I'm a bit more optimistic on the SME side that they might have fewer risks because they have their supply chain so closely, they're so close to them in the first place.
Yeah, so it's often informal. It's more an informal than a formal system, but it can be quite a lot of social capital.
Indeed, and the business model is built on a purpose statement rather than, a shareholder value proposition.
Okay, and this is again, it's sort of a practicality point, a bit like the evolution, a bit like the SME, but. Someone's pointed out in one of the early questions before the webinar that human rights is quite a broad concept. And of course, there's a list of human rights, I guess, and I don't know if we're all agreed on exactly what they are and which list we go from. Is that well established? But when it comes to, again, part of the journey, the evolution, are there some human rights that are more relevant, if I put it that way, to a business than others? Where can you start out is one way of putting it. Which human rights should we be focusing on?
Generally, I would say all human rights are important, but for practicality reasons, of course, companies need to prioritize, and that really depends on the sector you're in. So if you're in manufacturing and you produce in I don't know, over 100 countries around the globe, I think the labor rights issues in manufacturing are key. If you're a tech company, I don't know, in social media platform company, for example, I think, the hardware manufacturing is not your concern. However, there are other human rights issues that should be of great concern to you, including freedom of expression, the right to privacy. So depending on the industry, I think different human rights issues are more pertinent or salient. And this is where you start, because I'm actually not interested. So many years ago, a Swiss bank told me that they've now introduced recycling paper in their offices. And I said, oh, that's great. That's not how you make your money. I want to understand how businesses make their money and how these business models impact human rights. And if you're a social media company, I think, freedom of expression should be a key concern. And if you're a fashion company, the making of your clothes in factories around the world in the manufacturing process and labor rights should be your key concern. This is where you start. You don't start with fringe issues. You start with toughest issues.
And we are seeing codes of ethics now.
I would prioritize.
We'll talk about human rights, maybe in general terms. I guess one of the tests internally or externally to say, okay, you're in favor of human rights. So which human rights are the ones that you particularly have to focus on? And if someone can't answer that, which ones are salient, then you probably know that they're not actually really doing much about it. If they can come up and say, well, this is what we've been working on, and that suggests that they're taking things seriously because they've understood where that really intersects with their business.
Yes, and where the risks are the greatest. I mean, often the greatest risks are in the deepest layers of the supply chain. I mean, again, back to my cobalt work. If you're a manufacturer of an electric vehicle, you can, of course, work on diversity and inclusion at your tier one, your car part manufacturers. But if your entire strategy revolves around electric vehicles, I think you need to look at the greatest human rights issues, which are in the deepest layer of the supply chain, for example, in cobalt mining. And in cobalt mining, you have child labor, you have health and safety issues, you have, almost daily fatalities. So this is where you need to start. Then diversity and inclusion, I don't want to dismiss that topic at all. It's important too, but when the question is, where do you start? You start where the issues are the greatest. So
and in managing this, we talked a little bit about sort of inspections or social auditing type approaches. Of course, the other thing is that when things are not working properly, the people who really know are people on the ground. And many of the people who we work with in the Institute of Business Ethics have responsibilities for speak up or whistleblowing lines. Any thoughts about how they can be run effectively to at least achieve something in helping with the management of human rights down the supply chain?
I think it's central that I've worked in organisations with international footprints which have had purely internal speak up systems, but also those which have had independent external, and I think the difference is quite marked between the two. I think the external piece is vital, but it's around when those reports are made. It's around them deciding, and this comes back, I think, to the expertise and transparency issues that we spoke about earlier. It's when those issues are raised, is there the expertise internally to go and investigate, and is there the independence? And if there's not, is there a recognition that you need to bring that expertise in from outside and get an independent audit done, which, as Dorothée says, will look beyond the surface, will look right down the supply chain to see where those issues are at their very heart. And I think sometimes I've seen organisations which have what I would call surface level whistleblowing hotlines, but where when you dig beneath and turn and say, okay, so show me where you investigated, how deep that investigation went, it's still quite surface level. The complaint gets closed off very quickly or gets dealt with in a way which suggests it's an isolated incident, rather than questioning whether there's a systemic issue, whether there's a business model issue which underpins that question. And I think the transparency and expertise issues therefore come back to really link into that whole issue of whistleblowing hotlines, and whether there is a true desire to say, as Dorothy says, where do we make our money and where are our risks, and how open an organisation is willing to be on those issues.
And at the deepest level, it's getting actually the knowledge of those lines and ability to use them can be really difficult to a worker in Democratic Republic of Congo, but can't solve all the world's problems overnight. I suppose it's one tool that we might be able to use in some parts of the supply chain if people trust it, if people know about it, have access to it and trust it, and that companies then follow up.
And just very quickly, Chris, just to follow on from that I think that's exactly right, because I think that part of this is around, again, consultation with local communities. When I was in Burundi, when I was in Rwanda, when I was in Kenya, in some of the more remote areas which are impacted by investment, you turn and say to yourself, okay, how are they going to raise issues do they have? They're not going to have a fancy whistleblowing hotline. It's just not available. So companies' willingness to engage with NGOs or other organisations which are on the ground and to take in good faith the feedback from those local communities and then to investigate, I think is another sign of whether or not an organisation is serious about this or not. Because otherwise, what you're really saying is we've made available a hotline. Well, if you don't use it, well, then we're entitled to assume there's no issue. But really, you have to think about how many different forums have you provided for people to be able to raise those issues when they're living in very remote communities where telecommunications may be very poor.
Yeah. Okay. Now time is getting on. Should be wrapping up. So I just wanted to pick up one or two questions. Maybe we can just deal with. Well, we can't really deal with them quickly, but at least we can have a go at answering them quickly. Elise Moore was asking. Doro, about your idea of political CSR, if you're able to just say a tiny bit more about it, but also, does this mean corporates getting into the political arena? Is that what you mean by that? And is the risk or evidence that governments will step back and not do that? Because part of the reason, as you mentioned earlier, is that some governments just aren't very good. Will business getting involved give them even more excuse for not being very good? So just a little bit more about what you mean by political CSR in this context, I think would be interesting.
Yeah, it's a big question. I don't want to be too theoretical, but it certainly doesn't mean that I want to empower companies to lobby for their interests. So that would be the bad political influence that they could take. But instead, I'm asking companies to be what some have termed corporate citizens, where they step in when governments are unable or unwilling to protect basic human rights and step into that so-called governance gap and help to protect basic human rights. So that would be a political CSR version applied to business human rights. Okay, thank you for that. Another question, which I think is one I'd like Aaron to have a quick go at, if you wouldn't mind. I mean, thinking about the C-suite, which is very much where your fascinating and to some extent unique work has been because of the access you got. We've talked about things that might influence investors, employees, regulation, but what would really make the difference? What would be, as one our question has put it, the driving force for a revolution? And as another one put it, how could you in a sense get the C-suite to really take this on board? And we recognise the C-suite, it's a difficult place to work. No one's underestimating the pressures they're under. So how can, what would make the difference? And you're muted, Aaron.
Apologies. I think in some ways we have to look at those areas which the C-suite take as a given is part of their role. Nobody questions when it comes to financial modelling, financial valuations, how you get C-suite to take those seriously, because it forms part of their stakeholder relationships, it forms part of the incentivization that they are given, it forms part of the education that they've had, which enables them to rise up to the C-suite, it forms part of the transactions they've worked on. And so I think in the same way as financial value and strategic value have become a norm by which they are measured and judged and incentivized, the challenge is how do you make business ethics and human rights equally as normal for them, as a central part by which they are incentivized and think. And I think part of that is education, part of it is the bottom-up influences. So employees, I think, are a big part of this. Employees deciding this is an organisation with which I wish to be engaged. It's an organisation that I don't wish to be engaged with. I think customer pressure is an enormous part of that, and PR pressure. I think the investors are a big part of that, as we discussed earlier. I think local community is a big part of that. So I'm not sure there's one silver bullet. I wonder if it's a number of different stakeholders and influences which all must feed into corporations and say, this is not acceptable, to the extent that these things are not taken seriously. And I think incrementally, therefore, and I therefore think revolution would be great, but I think evolution is more realistic. I think it's incrementally you can start to change that mindset and that prioritization, and to make it a norm, and to make it as well spoken of and as challenged as we found with climate change issues. Again, not saying those are being perfectly addressed, but nobody sort of really questions those now as a market expectation. And it's very rare, and that they do. People do still question human rights as a market expectation and as a corporate responsibility.
There was actually a question about what progress we've made in the last 10 years, but just if sort of 5 or 10 seconds each, if you could point to a positive sign in this area that encourages you amongst all the gloom and all the challenge, any positive sign you would like to highlight, Doro?
Well, I'll go back to sort of the really long-term perspective in this field. And I'm, of course, thrilled that I work in a network of over 100 business schools that now take on human rights and integrate it into business school education. Because as we capacitate the next generation of leaders, I believe we're in a better place in the next generation to also handle these challenges. I agree with Aaron. The world is actually, and I'm quite optimistic that the world is developing in the direction that strengthens the ecosystem for taking on human rights and making human rights business relevant. So for C-suites, this is no longer something that they can ignore, because this ensures their future business success.
Okay, well, that's great. Let's leave it there. Future generations of leaders, and of course the people who've been watching today, this video now know more than they did at the beginning, I hope, and people who will watch the recording of this video in future. So that's my cue for saying, just remind people, this webinar will be available in the future. You'll get messages about that. It'll be on our YouTube channel at the Institute of Business Ethics. We try to keep a good program going, and are always keen to learn your views of it. So there will be a feedback survey. So if you'd like to send us feedback, you will be asked in a message you'll get afterwards, a little survey to complete. So that'd be great if you had time to do that. We've got, of course, more events and training coming up, so just have a look at our website for those. But thank you to all of you who have joined today to listen to what I thought was a really interesting webinar. Thank you too to Katie and Alex behind the scenes, getting things organised in advance and running on the day. But especially thanks to Doro and to Aaron for taking the time to share their expertise and their experience with us. So with that, wish you goodbye, and thank you for joining us today.